This is a production of the Ultimate Homeschool Radio Network. Welcome to the Vintage Homeschool Moms Show. Your host, Felice Gerwitz, is an author, a publisher, and your radio show host. She will encourage, educate, and inspire you with answers to your most pressing questions, from homeschool, marriage, parenting, and much more. Felice loves to equip moms to live a Christian life because every moment counts. Be sure to visit her website at mediaangels.com. And here's your host, Felice Gerwitz.
Hi everyone and welcome. This is Felice Gerwitz. This is an episode of Vintage Homeschool Moms Podcast 127. You can find the show notes at vintagehomeschoolmoms.com. And I want to thank our sponsors, which is mediaangels.com, and we'll hear more about that in just a little bit. Hey, today I want to give out a couple of shout-outs. First to Homeschooling IRL that is going to be publishing their 100th podcast. And where can you find them? By going to the ultimatehomeschoolradionetwork.com and looking for that bright red button that says Homeschooling IRL. You'll find Kendra and Fletch that have an amazing take on life. They are husband and wife. Kendra has been homeschooling for many, many years with the support of her husband, Fletch, who is a dentist when he's not podcasting for this network, and they do a great job. So I want you to go over and check out their show, and you can follow them on iTunes as well as many of the other podcast apps. I also want to give a shout out to our brand new show on this network, and that is the Homeschooling High School Podcast with the Seven Sisters. And if you wonder what the Seven Sisters, who they are and what they do, I invite you again to go to ultimatehomeschoolradionetwork.com and check them out. We're really excited to have a show that is dedicated specifically to homeschooling high school. And that is such a real blessing. That is one of the shows I've been actually praying for, that God would bring somebody along that would be willing and able to do that. And so they are taking that on, and I'm excited to have them on the network. So again, check them out. Their show is officially launched. Again, you can find them on the website, and soon they'll be available on iTunes. If you're listening to this in the archives, just check iTunes, and the show should be available, or you can listen on the website as well. Well, today I'm going to talk to you about an unofficial survey that I did on disciplining. In fact, I was with my youngest son in the car, and I said, hey, what do you think about disciplining that works? And immediately he just kind of looked at me, and I said, no, this is not, I'm not looking for some insights on, how to discipline you. I'm just doing this for my podcast. And he spoke for a good 5 minutes about, what he thought worked and didn't work. In fact, I was going into the bank, and I said, do you want to think about it? And he goes, no, I can tell you about it right now. And that was really enlightening. But I think the consensus is when discipline doesn't work, people get really irritated, as well as when discipline methods are unfair. And I looked at some interesting things on a website, and one of the websites in particular does not believe in disciplining or anything like that. They really are looking at it from the perspective of teaching our children to be able to deal with their emotions. And while I think that is wonderful and something that we definitely should incorporate with all of our children, they should, at some point self-discipline and, choose what is right just because it's the right thing to do and it's the moral thing to do. I know that a lot of times these websites that speak in this way are dealing with one or two children. And many times people who listen to this podcast in particular, and in the homeschool world in general, are homeschooling multi-age children. And so, first of all, what works with one kid doesn't work with another. And Many of us do not have hours to spend talking to our children and finding out exactly what the motivation is for whatever that issue is. So, while these techniques are wonderful, sometimes they're just not effective for our families. So everyone agrees that the best discipline, except for this one website again, is when the technique or the discipline is effective and it matches, the crime, whatever that is. But even so, what works for one kid, again, doesn't necessarily work for another, and we don't live in a perfect world. So what is the parent to do? I know that for me, I had to start all over as a younger mom, and then later as an older mom in what worked for me. So for me, the key to discipline, and I know you've all heard this, is consistency, and I'm going to go over this a little bit later. But if your kids know that you're going to stick with what you say you're going to do, it does work wonders. And I have 5 kids ages now, 35, 33, 20, 18, and 15. And I've had kids, as a young mom in my 20s and as an older mom in my late 30s and then early 40s. And having kids as a more mature mom really helped me learn from my mistakes, but that doesn't mean I didn't still make mistakes. And the first thing I want to do is go over some definitions. Why do we discipline in the first place? And, it's something that we need to look at. And whenever I ask these questions, if you would just grab a sheet of paper and jot these down or think about them. And sometimes, I know for me, when I listen to podcasts, I just sometimes just listen to them straight through. And then later I think about what they said, and I'll go back and listen and take notes. And so whatever works for you. But typically we discipline because the kids have stepped over some imaginary line or they've broken a rule, and whether it's spoken or unspoken. And audio isn't so much about prevention, but that is wonderful when it works and when you are consistent about it. And so I want to go through a little bit about prevention because, again, that is, I talk about secret sauce, and that is one of the secrets for, I think, why my disciplining techniques have worked or whether or not they failed. And it's not being preventive. So the first is to warn your kids ahead of time about what to expect. I remember walking into the store with my 2 oldest children when they were little. And I knew we were going to go into a store that had a lot of breakables. We were studying about Greece, and we were going into a place, in Florida that had a lot of things that it was like a little Greek community. And it had things like sponges and stuff from the ocean that could be, coral that could easily be broken. So I said to my kids, we're going to be walking into the store. We're not going to buy anything. I know you have some money that you want to spend. So again, setting the parameters. And I would like you to put either your hands in your pocket or walk with your hands behind your back. And we are not touching anything in here. If you do touch something, we're going to be going outside, And then I let them know, we are going to be going into a museum where you can touch things, which I love, the hands-on museums for kids where they do have that ability. And so we walked in the store, and they walked in there, with their hands behind their backs, and their cousins were there, and they heard all this, and they ended up, copying my kids and walking around, and they did really great. And then there was one section of the store where the store manager said, if the kids want to touch the sponges, they can. And my kids looked at me, and I said, yeah, that would be great. And so they did, and it was a very, very good experience. But how did I come to that? Because we walked into another place and, have you ever had to pay for something your kids have broken? Well, that will teach us, to give them a warning. So I think the warning the kids ahead of time about what to expect is wonderful. The second is being clear and going over the rules so they understand what is expected. For example, bedtime. Make sure it's a specific time and you have a routine. For example, we're going to take baths, have story time. If you take too long in your bath, we're not going to have time for stories, and so forth. I know that some people have the routines down pat, and that really helps a lot, because otherwise the kids don't know what to expect. A lot of times my grandkids come over here, and they'll be getting ready to go, or they've planned to take a bath here, and they just haven't had time or run out of time. And, there are tears and things like that, but my daughter has, many little kids, and so, they've all learned, and with more kids, sometimes it works better because of the peer pressure of their siblings. So they're going to learn pretty quickly, that it's better if they do what they're supposed to do, because it's going to help everyone. And, the third thing is practicing. My daughter did this extremely well. I did not do this very well with my kids. But she practices with the very young ones because, again, she has, the multi-age and the little kids. And she practices them coming when she calls them. And she's been to my house, come to my house where she's had to say, "I'm sorry, Grandma, Benny can't play right now," or, they're coming over because we're going to do some kind of crafts, or, which I love to do crafts, and I was really sad when my little kids were growing up because I had no one to do crafts with, and so now my daughter is giving me all these little grandchildren, so Grandma's really happy, and the kids are happy because Christina is not a big craft person, and that's my daughter. And so, poor Ben has to practice, standing up at the wall and practicing while Mommy calls him, because he didn't come to the car very quickly when she called him to come and get in the car to come to my house, or whatever the situation was. And she'll keep practicing until he looks at her and he comes quickly and gives her a hug or whatever she's told him he needs to do. So that really helps a lot, or saying that they're sorry if they've done something wrong, or asking forgiveness. Whatever that rule is, practicing when they're young really helps. The fourth is rewarding good behavior, or teaching kids to control their emotions. Again, that is something that can be instilled in small increments, pointing out a good behavior when someone's doing, a good job. That really helps. For example, even with my teenagers, and young adults in my house, when it's time to clear the table, everyone clears the table. If someone, picks up someone else's plate, I'll say, "Hey, thanks so much for grabbing my plate," or, just giving them that thank you, because sometimes we expect them to be obedient and to listen, and there's no accolades, because we forget about that. And basically, discipline falls into three very broad categories, and that is intervention, time outs, and taking things away. And I'm going to talk about these things because I'm going to tell you right now, I'm not a big fan of time out. It works for some kids and it doesn't work for others. But I am going to explain how I've been able to utilize that when I've been at wit's end. We're going to take a short commercial break, and when we come back, I will go through some of these things that I really feel help a lot and work for me. Are you looking for a Bible study for the entire family? Well, I created one after searching for months for a study that would encourage my family to have group discussions, teach life truth, as well as point to God as creator. So, since I couldn't find one, I created one. Homeschooling with Proverbs. I didn't want to zoom through the book of Proverbs in 1 month, as some suggest. Instead, I wanted to savor and meditate on the words and have the entire family on the same page. If you want a Bible study written for the entire family with specific audios and activities from pre-K to adult, look no further. This set can be used studying one lesson per month or completed in 9 months or sooner. The option is yours. In this set, you will find audios, printables, and when completed, you and your children will have a beautiful keepsake notebook. Visit homeschoolingwithproverbs.com for more information and begin studying the book of Proverbs. Allow God's Word to speak to you. Well, hi And welcome back. This is Felice Gerwitz with Vintage Homeschool Moms, and today we're talking about discipline. This is podcast 127, and you can find the show notes at vintagehomeschoolmoms.com. Well, before we went to break, I talked about, how disciplining falls into three very broad categories, and I just wish that, we had the time to really delve into each one of these, but I'm going to give you some things that have really worked for me. And each child, I really feel, is a puzzle, and we have to figure out what works. But one thing I want to discuss in this podcast is that, number one, without prayer, we can do nothing. So, I really have prayed disciplining my kids that it has fit the crime. And when they were little, it was really easier to discipline them. And I've really had, out of my 5 kids, one that is the most difficult to discipline, and that is my oldest child. And I remember when he first started driving, he had, some real attitude, and one of them was having a vehicle of his own. When they first started driving, my son and daughter shared a vehicle, and then at some point, that vehicle was sold, and then the kids each got their own cars because of different things. Neil started working, and Christina was going to college, and so when my son got his little dream truck, there was some real attitude there. There was a lot of this entitlement and sense of freedom that he had. Especially when they shared a vehicle, it was, having to coincide schedules and that sort of thing. And I believe this really stemmed from his not letting me know where he was going. And it was really at the very early stages of cell phones. And I don't even remember if he had a cell phone or not back then. Isn't that horrible? Cell phones was not something that everybody had, like kids and, adults do now. Everybody has a phone, but it was more of a luxury item back then. But anyway, I was so upset with my son that when he came back home, I told him, I said, I'm so upset with you that I'm going to pray that the Lord gives me, what your discipline should be, because I'm super upset. And he pretty much laughed, kind of scoffed a little bit and shrugged his shoulders and walked in. The child's too big to bend over and spank, which was what I wanted to do in my mind. And I wasn't always a big spanker. As a child, I was spanked quite a bit. My husband was very strictly disciplined, and so I think both of us weren't, that wasn't the biggest thing. My husband definitely more than I was, but screaming and yelling was the norm in my house, and I always said, I would yell and scream too because it made me feel better, but it didn't, then you look at the fallout of your kids. So, again, I learned that wasn't going to work very well in our family, and so anyway, going back to my son, when I was praying to the Lord said, take away the car keys. And I thought, that's going to be just such a temporary fix. And so I really got from the Lord, it wasn't just take away the keys. I kind of had like this little vision. I had this, in our laundry room, we had this little plaque that had hooks on it. And that's where my husband came in and put the keys, or we would put extra sets of keys on that hook, so that if someone needed to move my car, or one of the trucks needed to get moved, there would be extra set of keys there, so you didn't have to track the person down. And so I told my son, I said, because that's where I felt like the Lord said to put his keys, and I said to my son, I said, you no longer get the privilege of keeping your keys in your pocket. And I'm not just talking about the extra set of keys. You will keep your keys in the laundry room until, this changes and this behavior changes. He was so upset. I really didn't think it would even, what's the big deal, hang up your keys? But that really worked. And after that, whenever I would say, I'm very upset, I'm going to pray about what, the discipline should be, my kids didn't laugh anymore. It just took that one time. So that really works. So if you're at wit's end and your kids are older especially, or even if they're younger, I would resort to asking the Lord in prayer. The second is explaining to them that life is not fair. I'm not an advocate of asking my kids what color cup they want or what they wanted to do, especially because many times it would be, would you like to take a bath now? No. Well, when do you want to take a bath? A little later, or asking the kids things that are just setting yourself up for this big argument. Even when the grandkids come over, I have a specific cup that they can use. Each one of them has their own cup. I ended up buying my daughter this set of thermos cups, and it's assigned every day. They get a new one, and it gets washed out, and that has worked really well. So we can do some things that really help our kids. Not setting them up for, I always want the red cup, or I want the pink sippy cup, or whatever that is. And also explaining to them, for example, when they wanted to go somewhere, like let's say spending the night, and I would just say, no, we don't do that in this family. And they would say, it's not fair. I would explain to them, that's right, life is not fair. And let's just get that over with. It's a life lesson that we all learn. I think that, we need to teach our kids to make informed decisions, and there are times to get them to do that. But again, in larger families, that is something that is very, very difficult to do, making everyone happy. And that's the problem. I think as parents, we want our children to be happy and well balanced, but we're going to find that our kids are happiest when they are doing what they're supposed to do, and there is peace in the family. Another thing that I did was assigning things. Maybe this is the teacher in me, but I would assign things like, places where they sit at dinner time, or assigning seats in the car. And we did different things according to birth orders. For example, when the kids were little and I needed to reach the car seats, they would sit where I could put them and reach their seat easily. But as they got older, my older, and this is of the older kids, like when I had the first two kids and just had the two until they were 12 and 14, and I had the next three in the subsequent years, it was easier to just take turns. We'd go one place and they would remember whose turn it was to sit in the front, and they didn't argue. But when I had the next three, first of all, nobody sits in the front because that was a new thing with airbags. And then secondly, when my oldest of the three was Nick, he would sit in the front and he would just look at the other two and he would just say, I'm the oldest. Mom gives me more responsibility. I take out the trash. So if you want to sit in the front seat, first of all, you need to be, this heavy and this height. He had it down to a science. He was an old soul, I have to say. And you're going to have to be responsible and take out the trash and do some of the things I do. And so I've got that as another line item here, enlisting the help of your firstborn. But, again, it depends on your child. My oldest wouldn't have been as diplomatic as my number 3 child is, because he was like the oldest of the youngest. You've got that? And so, when Nick and Ann and Mike were growing up, Christina, was in her teen years, and then going to college when Michael was, 1 year old, I believe. And so, they weren't around as much, and Neil was working at that point. So anyway, assigning things really helped. I mean, to this day, Michael sits next to me because when he was the youngest, he sat next to me because I helped him with his meal. And so to this day, he still sits next to me. And so it just helps. So when they understand what the rules are, it makes life go easier. The number 4 points. So one is disciplining, with prayer. The second is life isn't fair, teaching that. Number 3 is assigning things, whether it's a cup or a place at dinner time or in the car. The fourth is to enlist the help of your firstborn. And first of all, it doesn't work if your oldest is not kind. So, if they're going to be helping you with your disciplining, they need to understand the rules, and they need to discipline, if they're disciplining their siblings with love. And what I mean by that is they're not going to impart, oh, you did this, so now this is your punishment. But they are going to help them to do what is right. And that could mean, we're getting out of the car, and the little one wants to dart into the road, and the older sibling grabs the child by the hand. Things like that. I have watched older siblings do absolutely nothing. We were at church one time, and actually leaving church, the building, and I just watched this little 2-year-old, running up and down the pews and having this grand old time, thinking it was like a racing, strip, and the older sibling that was a teenager sitting there just laughing at the 2-year-old being bad, and the mom talking and trying to stop her conversation to go get her child who was making a lot of noise. And so I thought about that later, and I thought, gosh, if it was my kids, that little one wouldn't have gotten away. Someone would have grabbed him. It happens at church when we go to church with my daughter and her little kids. If they're sitting with my older kids, which are initially, actually they're aunts and uncles, and one of the little ones is not sitting still, my daughter or my son will tell the child, you need to go sit with mom. They're not disciplining the little one, but they're not allowing the little one to be loud or do what is wrong while the service is going on. And so, things like that really help a lot. Same thing if we've gone out to eat and the kids aren't behaving, they get to go back to mom and dad instead of getting to sit, next to someone that they want to sit with. The fifth thing is, teaching our children, first of all, to control their emotions, and also what happens when there is a meltdown. So if there's a meltdown or consistent whining, one of the things I've done is said to the kids, listen, I will listen when you're ready to talk. If they're just screaming hysterically because they're angry about something, I'll first say to them, are you hurt? And they'll say no, and then they're screaming at the top of their lungs because they want to tell you, someone took my toy or whatever it is. The first thing I'll do is, I'll say, I'll listen when you're ready to talk. If that doesn't work, that's when I will put them in timeout. And especially if this is in my home when I have the little kids here, the grandkids, and my daughter isn't here, because I read on one website they were talking about, well, remove yourself or walk out of the room. That's great if you have one kid, and maybe you can do that. But if I have one 4-year-old that's screaming at the top of their lungs because their 2-year-old brother took a toy, and I have 4 other little kids, I cannot remove myself. It's easier to remove the child. So the child has to go into the corner, and when they're ready, when they've calmed down, and sometimes they're that upset that they need to scream and yell in that corner. And I'll walk over in there and I'll say, it's just going to take longer. And I might have to set the timer for 30 seconds after you stop, screaming or whatever it is. And so that usually calms them down. And when they're done, we can discuss it and try to resolve the issue. Another is avoid power struggles. I have to admit that, even at my age now, my teenage daughter had to remind me of this. So, the 2-year-old one day was really upset. Everybody was at the house, and we had dinner, and my daughter and son-in-law were out on a date, and we were all watching the kids, and I had a lot of help. And I was at the kitchen, and I remember the 2-year-old coming up to me and saying, I want my mommy. And he got really upset, and he started walking out. And I said, you cannot go outside. You need to come back in. And everybody else is on the couch and, has a babe or two on either side of them. And they have their feet up, and they're watching a movie and popcorn. And I'm sitting here arguing with this 2-year-old. And my daughter finally said, Mom, quit arguing with him. And I said, well, that's, he's ready to walk out the door. And she said he's not going to. And I kind of stood there and watched, and he did head out into the laundry room, but everything was dark, and he, quickly came back. And of course, I was ready to spring out, and have had the stubborn ones who have, walked out of the laundry room, down the stairs, into the garage, and into the front yard, no matter if it was dark or not. And, of course, Grandma gets the opportunity of following them out there. But once they saw the car wasn't there, then when they were able to come back in. And so, again, I was able to do that because I had help and the other kids were being tended to. Otherwise I probably would have picked up the kid and said, lock the door, which it's amazing how resourceful these kids are. And a locked door usually doesn't, work that well because they're escape artists and they're good at that. So, again, that's been the only time timeout has worked for me. And that is the other thing that I've had to say to the little one, if you can't be good, then your mom's not going to let you come back, or she's not going to let you stay, and that's another effective thing. Yes, that is threatening, but they know I will stand with it because I've had to I hate to complain about the kids because I want my daughter to at least enjoy her evening out with her husband, but she will reinforce whatever it is that I say, and she's actually a lot stricter than I am. Number 6 is money. Again, I don't like to argue with my kids, but I would do the preventative thing before we went into the store. And, to me, prevention is the best advice that I can give. And I'm going to share with you something I'm a little bit embarrassed about, but it's a true story. After we built our new house, we went to the stores, and I just said to my kids, look, Mommy used to buy, and I'm a spoiler. I have to say my love language is baking you cookies or buying you something or giving you something for free, which is why I love this podcast network that I own, because I like to give things away. And, the audios are all free. However, at this point, it kind of backfired because I wanted the kids to know that, we're not going to be doing this anymore. So what did I tell them? I said, look, we are poor. We just built a new house. And so we cannot go to the store and buy toys and things like that. We're just going to have to buy our groceries and the stuff we need, and that's it. Well, unfortunately for me, my little kids shared this with their friends, and a well-meaning friend of mine shared the information with me and said, did you tell your kids you were poor? And I had to say, yeah, how did you know that? Well, come to find out, they shared it with her daughter, and so then I had to sit down and say to my kids, look, it's not that we're really, really poor, but Daddy and I discussed a budget, and since not only did we build a brand new house, but we had to buy a bunch of furniture for our now larger house, we want to just spend our money on, the things that we need for right now, and we're saving our money, and we're just not going to buy a lot of little toys, unless it's a birthday or something special. And so, they understood that, but I just had to let them know that ahead of time, because they might have seen, how the checkouts are horrible, and they stacked it against us parents or even the grandparents because there's gum and candy and whatever. So, that's one of the things that, you need to let them know ahead of time. The second is if it's their money. And when they were little, I would just warn them, that if you spend all your money, you're not going to have any left. And I just let them make their mistakes, and hopefully they'll learn from that, because when they get older, you can make recommendations, but it's not always going to be effective. And I am a hands-off pretty much mother and mother-in-law to my kids. They're adults and they need to make their own decisions. I don't tell my daughter how many kids she can or can't have. That's not my business. When I've been asked, how many children my daughter is going to have, who's now expecting her 7th, I basically say, what? It's not my business. It's up to her and her husband and God, what they feel directed. And I'm not even going to get on that topic right now, because I could I have a lot to say about that, but I don't want to get off on another topic. The point is that we have to make decisions for our family and what works for us. And so, The biggest thing we want to avoid is a meltdown at the grocery store or allowing our kids to pitch a fit, and if they're not going to get something. And I really believe that consequences are important. I know that, again, on this one website that really irritated me, it had all these things about how consequences were ineffective and you really needed to teach them all this other stuff. And there was a lot of talking going on and a lot of empathizing and a lot of acknowledging of feelings. And while I have to say all of that is very well and good, that a lot of times it's self-serving and, it's not understanding that it's easier to run that red light, than it is to stop. Even with the consequences that happen here in Florida, you never go when that light turns green. Why? Because half the people are not stopping when that other light turns red. And so, if you're quick on the draw and you want to, just step on the gas, that is not the thing to do if you're driving the Florida roads. Because people, even though they know the consequences, it's death in a car, are going to run that red light. And so while it's great that people that are the psychologists or that, write these blog posts want to explain, that consequences are not always effective. In that case, I would have to say, they're right to a degree, but another is allowing our children to learn those hard lessons. The hard lesson of when you're not, listening to what you're supposed to do, you're not going to get to have your friends over to play, or you're not going to get to go to your game tonight. And that's a hard one because especially if the coaches are relying on a child to play. I know one time in Little League, all the parents were really upset. Our catcher was really good, and his dad is a police officer, actually a sheriff, and he was sitting next to his dad in the bleachers, and I didn't say anything. Because it's so funny. We kind of had assigned seating in our Little League where moms and dads sat, and I always sat at the very top because you had that support in the back, and the sheriff sat next to me or near me, and his son was there, and I just looked at him and smiled, and his wife came and she was pretty upset, and apparently he had not gotten a good grade on a test, and all the other parents were like, "Oh, is he okay? Is he sick?" And sheriff shook his head and said, "No, he's fine." And he didn't give any more information, and everybody was wondering, well, later I found out what had happened and everything, and all the parents were upset because we lost the game because our catcher was really good and he didn't get to play. But I told the dad, I said, "Look, this was not a playoff game. This was, yes, we lost a game, but I think that what he learned was so much more valuable." And that was his dad told him to study for his test. He did not study for his test, and I don't even remember what grade he got. He didn't fail it, but maybe he got a B or a C. And his dad was trying to teach him a lesson that, I told you that if you get your C's or whatever grade it was, you're not going to get to play. Well, I'm sure that young man learned a lesson because not only did he have to come and get all these questions from his peer group, but he also taught everybody a very good lesson, and that definitely was an effective use of consequences. The seventh is consistency, and that is very important. If you're the threatening, repeating parent, and you never say what you mean, or you change your mind, your kids are going to be upset, and they're not going to trust you. And I'm going to share a story about spending the night. And truthfully, the problem here was I didn't like my kids to spend the night, period. And that was my fault for even allowing them the opportunity to spend the night because I set myself up with, again, we want our kids happy and everybody else is spending the night. Well, one of my daughters really loved spending the night. And so she wanted to talk to her friend on the phone, and every time she talked to her friend on the phone or we went on a little homeschool field trip, invariably they'd want to spend the night or get together afterwards. So I said to my daughter, yes, you can call your friend, you can talk to her. However, You may not ask her to spend the night, and if she asks you, you will tell her no. Do you understand that? And she said yes. Well, next thing I know, she's handing me the phone, and she's not asking me to spend the night, nor is her friend asking me to spend the night. However, the mom's on the other end, and the mom is asking me if they can spend the night. Now, she didn't get the whole entire memo of what I had told my daughter, and I said to the mom, thank you so much for inviting her, but no, she will not be able to spend the night. And let me explain why. And I told the mom, who of course didn't know, that I had already said to my daughter, don't plan this. And when we got off the phone, I was so upset. I said to my daughter, and this was a rash decision, which I did not stop and pray about it, but I had to be held accountable to my words because I made such a big deal about it. And I said to my daughter, I said, not only will you not spend the night this one time, but you will not spend the night for 1 year. And we're going to mark it on the calendar of when this is. Well, of course, she had a meltdown, and I sent her to her room, and, mom's not fair, and so on and so forth. But I held to that. But not only that, everyone else found out about it. And I would hear things like, one of my friends told me, she goes, oh, this is great, because now I say to my kids, do you want me to do what Mrs. Gerwitz did to Christina? So now that my daughter is an adult with kids of her own, she understands my aversion to spending the night. And she doesn't allow her kids to do it either, and this was a hard lesson for her to learn. It was hard for me to stand by, for an entire year. And by the end of that year, I just basically explained to my daughter, that I wasn't happy with it. And I believe at that time she was in the 2nd grade. And I just didn't want to set a precedent. Why don't I like spending the night? I explained to her, number one, it's never ending. Once she did it, that was it. The second was, I told her, I said, you're so exhausted from staying up late. Then you're sick usually when you come home because you've eaten so much junk, and it takes you days to get over. And the third was that, her behavior was atrocious when she did get home, and it took days to get back to what is normal. So when I say no, it means no, and I had to learn that I could not vacillate on it. I remember my son one time saying to me, this is my oldest, and he would say, you said I couldn't do whatever, and when can I earn it back? Because I was letting them earn back whatever it was that they wanted. And so I found out, you know what? I'm setting myself up because they're just thinking, okay, well, I did this wrong, and I can earn it back. So I had to, again, explain to my kids, no, that is not right. And I had to say, that when I say something, I mean it. And the same needs to be for them, which brings us to point number 8, to be responsible for your words, and they need to be responsible for their words. So whenever they say something, like we just had a no swearing rule in our family, and that was it. You don't want your kids growing up like my niece, who will remain unnamed. But we're, as Catholics, we give up something the 40 days before Lent. And, she sent me something, a text, and said, oh, no, I didn't give up candy this year. I gave up swearing. So, of course, I gave her a really hard time about this. But, are you kidding me? This is what you have to give up? And we don't want to, and I know as a kid she didn't swear, but you don't want to grow up into that, whether that's what your workplace is happening in your workplace, or, if you just think that's cool. And, my boys work on a construction site. My husband works on a construction site, and there's a lot of swearing that goes on there, but it's not permitted in my family or in the home. And I know it's happening when it slips at home. And so, my husband, I'm very grateful and thankful that he isn't, one who swears. So praise God for that. And so, it is something that you want to make sure, and especially taking the Lord's name in vain, which is so sinful and not accepted, and nothing that my kids do. However, even quote unquote the minor words are not acceptable. So, we want to teach our kids very young that they're responsible for their words and, of course, setting a good example. And that precludes all of this. If we're having a meltdown like the 4-year-old and arguing with the 4-year-old and acting like a 4-year-old, then we're not setting a good example. And I didn't even touch on our example. I'm assuming the best from all of us. The reason I'm talking about the responsibility for the words, I'm going to use the example of boredom. If my kids ever said they were bored, I'd say to them, wow, that's amazing, because you know what that means to Mommy? And they'd say, what? And I'd say, being bored means, Mom, give me some work to do. Believe me, my kids quickly learned how to entertain themselves. My kids never said they were bored after the first initial times. Because if they did, that's exactly what I would say, and I would give them some type of work to do. Either it was a little bit more schoolwork, which I always said, isn't it great being homeschooled? Because Mom can always find more schoolwork to do. Not necessarily to use it as a punishment, but to teach them to be able to entertain themselves. And there was plenty of things to do. So the best advice I can give you in a nutshell is prevention, consistency, and prayer, and not necessarily in that order. Listen, God bless, God gave us these kids, and He also equips us with the tools that He wants of us. If we're grounded in His Word, we're reading the Bible, we are praying, we are being consistent, we are immersed in what the Lord wants for us. We're not going to have to answer questions like, well, how many kids, is your daughter going to have or not have, or deal with this sarcastic response from people. We want to be shining examples not only to our children but to those around us, and we want to do what's right and teach our children to love doing what's right and that it is honoring to the Lord. So I just pray that this audio has been helpful. Please drop us a line at vintagehomeschoolmoms.com. You can comment at any time on these posts. And if you want to really thank me, if you go over to iTunes and leave me a comment there or give us a star rating on this show or any of the shows on our network. And be sure to catch that new show coming up, which is the high school podcast, and that is the Homeschool High School podcast. Again, thanks so much. God bless, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks for tuning in to the Vintage Homeschool Mom Show. Visit Felice at MediaAngels.com and TheVintageHomeschoolMoms.com. Vintage Homeschool Moms is a production of the Ultimate Homeschool Radio Network.